Nothing broke. No messages left unanswered. No obvious pain. But at some point, you stopped feeling like the one living your life. There was no collapse, just a quiet replacement. You kept moving, but something else took your place. For a long time, this advice sounded harmless, even generous. Follow your passion. It appeared everywhere, in graduation speeches, career talks, interviews with successful people, and casual conversations about what it means to live a good life. It was repeated so often that it stopped sounding like advice and slowly began to sound like a universal truth. If something excited you, you were told it must mean something. If something felt heavy, slow, or uncomfortable, you were told it was a sign you were moving in the wrong direction. The promise hidden inside this advice was subtle, but powerful. Fulfillment was supposed to feel natural. Meaning was supposed to feel obvious. Life was supposed to respond quickly when you were on the right path. And if it didn't, the assumption was rarely that growth required patience. The assumption was that you had chosen incorrectly. Very few people questioned this logic. Why would they? It sounded optimistic. It sounded humane. It sounded like freedom. It framed life as something that should feel aligned at all times, and framed struggle as a signal to escape rather than something to understand. But quietly, without resistance or debate, this way of thinking began to reshape how people interpreted discomfort, commitment, and direction. Not enough to feel wrong. Not enough to trigger alarm. Just enough to change how decisions were made, slowly, repeatedly, and without awareness. At some point, feeling replaced understanding. Passion stopped being a signal and became a command. People were taught to trust what felt energizing in the moment and to distrust anything that required endurance, repetition, or sacrifice. Difficulty became suspicious. Silence became something to escape. Stability began to feel like stagnation. Instead of asking what was worth carrying over time, people began asking what felt right now. And because feelings are unstable by nature, direction became unstable too. The compass kept spinning. Choices were made based on intensity rather than depth, stimulation rather than substance. When excitement faded, as it inevitably does, people didn't question the framework guiding them. They questioned the path. Or worse, they questioned themselves. They assumed they had missed something, chosen wrong, failed to listen carefully enough to their intuition. And so movement became the default solution. A change, a pivot, a new plan, a new version of the self. Not because something meaningful was calling them forward, but because staying no longer felt justified without emotional reinforcement. Passion was never the enemy. Passion is human. It is powerful. It creates momentum. It can open doors that would otherwise remain closed. But passion is also temporary. It rises, fades, shifts, and disappears. It is influenced by novelty, by mood, by context, by energy. Building an entire life around something so volatile required constant adjustment, constant reinvention, constant searching for the next emotional signal that would justify continuing. When passion faded, people assumed something was broken, not in the advice, but in themselves. So they searched for a new passion, a new calling, a new identity, again and again, each time believing that the next feeling would finally be stable enough to support a life. What they were never told was that meaning is not built on intensity. It is built on continuity, on staying long enough for responsibility, depth, and structure to emerge. Passion can initiate movement, but it was never meant to be the foundation that carries weight once novelty fades. When passion becomes the foundation, identity becomes fragile. You are only as grounded as your current interest. The moment enthusiasm fades, uncertainty takes over, direction dissolves, and restlessness begins to masquerade as intuition. Movement feels necessary, even when nothing is actually calling you forward. Over time, this creates a subtle form of instability. Not chaos, not collapse, just drift, motion without arrival, progress without grounding. People remain productive, capable, and outwardly functional, yet internally unanchored. Because nothing visibly breaks, the confusion is internalized instead of questioned. Staying begins to feel like failure. Commitment begins to feel like a trap. And the ability to tolerate boredom, silence, or difficulty slowly erodes. Not because people are weak, but because they were taught to interpret those states as signs they were doing something wrong. Years later, many people find themselves outwardly fine and inwardly disconnected. They didn't fail. They followed advice that never asked them to build endurance, responsibility, or depth. Life continued. Careers progressed. Relationships formed. But something underneath felt strangely hollow. Nothing collapsed. Everything simply became lighter, more superficial, harder to anchor. And without realizing it, people learned how to stay busy instead of staying present. They learned how to function efficiently while quietly losing contact with what made any of it meaningful. The most damaging advice is rarely the one that sounds wrong. It is the one that sounds right and goes unquestioned. Passion can guide moments. It can open doors. But meaning is what sustains a life once the excitement fades. When feeling becomes the compass, people keep moving, but rarely arrive. And the cost is not visible failure. It is quiet disorientation. This channel exists to examine the ideas that shaped us quietly, not to reject them blindly, but to understand what they replaced. If this stayed with you, the next video explores what people turn to when this emptiness appears, and why most of those attempts only deepen it.